Hello and welcome to the 4 Principles for Campaigners Working with the New Government webinar. My name is Woody Faulkner, External Relations Assistant here at NCVO, joined by Chris Walker, Senior External Relations at NCVO, and he will be giving a presentation today, and we're also joined by Lauren, our webinar organiser. The webinar today will be a 30-minute presentation from Chris, after which there'll be a 15-minute opportunity for a Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the session, then please feel free to type the questions into the question box on the right at any point, and we'll be answering them at the end. And can I ask that please, can you complete the short follow-up survey upon exiting the webinar? It helps us to work out whether you liked it and what we can improve. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Willie, for that introduction. So just to start with, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. We're going to be exploring 4 principles of working with a new government. So I'm hoping to have a bit of practical things that you can actually be doing in terms of engaging with new ministers, officials, etc. But also a little bit on how you might want to frame your agenda in response to what the government are talking about. We'll also briefly introduce you to NCVO's guides to good campaigning. And then thinking as well as the opportunities to engage with a new government, also thinking about what that means in terms of engaging with former ministers and other prominent backbenchers. And we'll also take a bit of a look at some of the pros and cons of governmental change. But just to kind of kick us off, we're going to start with a poll question. This is, I think, just to get a sense of how people are feeling about the opportunities in the new government. So just think about in terms of engagement with the May government compared to the Cameron government. How do you feel? Whether you're also more optimistic that the May government is going to be much better, provide much better opportunities for charities to engage with. If you're more pessimistic, if you think actually we've lost an opportunity, we've perhaps lost a bit of influence potentially with the Cameron government, and then also perhaps if you're not sure, if you feel like we haven't seen enough yet to enable us to really kind of make that judgment. So I think it's just useful for us to kind of get a sense of how people are feeling about the new government and sort of what the opportunities are for charities. So I think we should be hopefully getting some results soon. Okay, that's interesting. So quite a lot of people still at the moment unsure. I think it's understandable because we haven't really seen that much in terms of what the new government agenda is going to look like. But of those who have made their mind up, clearly a bit more pessimistic than optimistic at the moment. So as we talk a bit about the agenda, perhaps we'll see why perhaps that is. But yeah, so very interesting results. So looking at what governmental change means for charities. So I think there are certainly some real positives of that. So if in the past you've had a poor relationship with ministers, or even where perhaps things have got a bit strained over 1 or 2 policy decisions, actually a new start with a new minister can be a really positive thing, allow you to build a new relationship, start from scratch, and kind of adopt a more positive approach to engagement. Sometimes we can also get a bit of an opportunity to revisit existing policy where there are perhaps policy decisions that we don't like. So particularly where something might not have been fully implemented by the last government, there could still be a chance to change direction for the government and for charities to influence that direction. So one very high profile example that we've already seen is that the government is now taking more time to make a final decision on Hinkley Point. So I think we'll probably see a few more things like that over the next couple of months, where things that we thought had been decided get looked at again. But equally, some of this change could potentially lead to charities losing influence. So when charities have seen a friendly minister who they've developed a good relationship with leave, that's going to take a bit of time to replicate. And it may not, if you've got a really good relationship with the minister, he really kind of gets where you're coming from, it might not even be possible to rebuild or replicate that sort of relationship. And what also tends to happen with new ministers and can be quite frustrating is you'll suddenly lose a lot of the expertise they had in the policy area. And in some cases, you might find yourself having to go right back to the basics, say discussing things with a new minister, which you sort of already developed an understanding with the previous minister. They sort of knew where you were coming from and could work sort of with them on that. So I'm going to look at the first principle. Actually, I'm going to start by just going through quickly the 4 principles, and then we'll look at each of them in turn in a bit more detail. So the first one will be that when you're kind of making your initial communications, it's more important that it's well thought through, and you just get it off as quickly as possible. Important to really kind of focus on your expertise and how it fits in with the new agenda. Thirdly, having some clear specific actions that new ministers can take. And fourthly, looking to enable links with your beneficiaries to the government. So starting with that first principle, so lots of organisations send welcome letters to new ministers, and many of you may have already sort of done that. And I certainly, if there are particular new ministers you want to work with, I'd very much recommend that. Generally speaking, I wouldn't get too hung up on whether you kind of get it in the next day or whether it takes a week or two, just to kind of really work on your message. The important thing to remember with those kind of welcome letters, the initial contact, is that new ministers just really get sort of inundated with this kind of stuff. So it's really much more important to be clear about your vision of the relevant policy area, and particularly what you can offer to help them achieve this. So, for example, actually one thing that potentially is quite useful when you get a new minister is, particularly they have a track record in a particular policy area. Actually, you might want to try and get a sense of what it is that they want to do through sort of early speeches, early interventions, which will then give you a bit of a better chance of really providing them with what they want. So looking at the second principle, which I think fits in with that a bit as well, possibly does seem like quite an obvious thing to say, but a really key thing to think about when working with a new government is really understanding what it is that your organisation can uniquely offer to them. So on one level, that means understanding where your expertise lies, what it is that you are the, if not world expert, then the national expert in, and then making sure that you are able to fit that in with the government's agenda and apply it to what the government wants to be doing. So, for example, we've now have a new Secretary of State at Culture, Media and Sports, responsible for charities through the Office for Civil Society. And in Karen Bradley's sort of first speech, she really focused on how she's really keen to improve access to culture for everyone, for sort of all sectors of society. So for us, looking at that then gives us a sense of, well, we think there's a really important role for charities to play in that, and so we can now discuss that with her and really kind of frame what our approach to what we want DCNS to do, understanding that this is going to be a key objective for the new Secretary of State. So, having just talked about the need to work out how you can help deliver the new government's agenda, I think it's worth taking a quick look at what we know so far. So, throughout Theresa May's leadership campaign, and I think the early days of her premiership, we've seen this real focus on social reform, right at the heart of the government's agenda. Now, I know a lot of charities will look at that and say, well, okay, we'll believe it when we see it, but it certainly gives you a really good opportunity to be able to frame the ask that you make of government within their desire to kind of achieve these social reforms. So I think it's a really useful starting point for charities to be able to look at. I think a thing I've kind of really taken away from Theresa May at the moment is that she's really seeking to draw a line under the Cameron government and the Cameron style of government. And we've had the sort of briefings that she's going to and cronyism. The story put out there that there'll be fewer special advisors, which I think she's now backtracked on, but there's this sense as well, I think, that Theresa May as a person is going to be taking much longer on taking key decisions, possibly consulting more. And then possibly, as we've seen on grammar schools, I think we might see an attempt to return to some of the values and priorities of what you might consider a more traditional Conservative government. And then one other thing that I've really noticed about so far is that, yes, it has been recess, but I think it's really noticeable how little we've seen of Theresa May on TV. So it'd be interesting to kind of get a sense of if that's a new approach to media management, not wanting to be. I think David Cameron was often seen as kind of like almost like a commentator, appearing regularly on the news when some things happened and putting in his kind of input. But I think generally everything we've seen so far suggests we're going to have this sort of a slightly longer period in terms of making decisions, but perhaps with the opportunity for that sort of detailed consideration. So could arguably be less good for a charity if you've got a minister to agree to a policy that he supports, but potentially a chance to prevent some of those really poor policy decisions that kind of slip through the net and get sort of driven by perhaps the media agenda rather than sound policy. But I think aside from this, we have seen this stuff on things like grammar schools, but also I think there are some potential opportunities there for public service reform if you look at the appointments that Theresa May had made to kind of more public service delivery elements of her cabinet. People like Justine Greening at Education, Damien Green at Department for Work and Pensions. These are people very much from the reformist wing of the Conservative Party, and I think real opportunities there potentially for charities to try and influence things going forward. And then the other thing that kind of hangs over all of this is the need to implement Brexit. So that's going to take a huge amount of time. It's going to be a really important thing for charities to be contributing to. I hope that the government will welcome that input. Certainly the any indications we've had, they're very keen to talk to people with expertise across a whole range of areas and really get their input on what their sort of key, on what the key things that we need to be looking at are as part of that negotiation. Looking at some of the changes we've had in departments and potentially approach the machinery of government changes. So I mentioned briefly earlier, the Office for Civil Society has now moved to Department for Culture, Media and Sport. So I think there is probably a bit of concern potentially about what that might mean for public service delivery and social investment. So also I'd be keen to see how DCMS approach that. But I think there is a lot of similarity and areas that cross over already. So for example, we've got lottery distributors there. There's a lot of work that DCMS does with charities. But also I think there's a real opportunity to now engage with the department outside the Office for Civil Society, and in particular I think one of the challenges that we had with Cabinet Office, there isn't sort of like an obvious person around the Cabinet table who is going to go to bat for charities. I'm not saying that this is going to be something that Cameron Bradley is definitely going to do, but it feels like there is more of an opportunity for us to have someone when these issues are being discussed at cabinet level who is going to actually make have a positive view of what charities contribute potentially. Many environmental charities I think are going to be concerned about losing the Energy and Climate Change Department being scrapped and moved into an expanded BIS, now the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I think in Greg Clark and Nick Hurd, there are two sort of key ministers involved who are personally committed to tackling climate change. But it is hard to see how the loss of the department doesn't mean to some extent a downgrading of priority of climate change within government. And actually, we can talk about people having ministers who are committed but that means we're also going to be more reliant on having ministers in the future in those roles who really kind of get climate change. So it doesn't feel like in the long term that it's really going to be helpful for that sort of our attempts to tackle climate change. And then I think another area where there is going to be a lot of concern is around international development. So we've got Priti Patel as the new Secretary of State, who previously proposed scrapping the department. I think that's one thing, but actually, in a sense, almost more worrying are some recent pronouncements, which are kind of more really suggesting that aid is seen by the government as primarily a route to trade. So I think that will certainly be a concern for international charities. So I think here is actually somewhere where this principle of fitting with government agenda could actually be really important and might help charities. Clearly, they're going to need to oppose where policy is going to be damaging to the overall objectives of international aid. But if charities are able to demonstrate how they can make a difference in areas which are personally important to the new Secretary of State, then I think it will help. But I can't pretend there's not going to be a massive challenge, I think, to deal with that. So looking at our second poll question, so we've covered some of the key, what we think are some of the key aspects of the May government agenda. So what we were interested to hear from people attending this webinar today is whether you have identified how your organisation can contribute to that new May government agenda. So we've got a few kind of different options there. So we've got yes, if you have identified some positive opportunities which will allow you to contribute. We've also got no, if it's not clear to you what the government wants in your area at the moment. There's also no, if you're finding it hard to find areas of agreement. So you perhaps know what the agenda is, but it's been very difficult to find those areas on which you can support. And also no, if you just haven't really got around to thinking about this and sort of what your role could be at the moment. So I think it'd be useful to get a sense of, and again, perhaps we might find some things linked to our first polling question where people are still a little bit pessimistic about what the new government means for their ability to engage. So interesting to see what we get. Okay, so that I think this feels like good news to me. We've got some nearly half of you attending today have managed to identify some positive opportunities. And then I think understandably there's still kind of about a third, I think, who are it's still not clear, and I think that's, you know, yeah, in a lot of areas we haven't really had the agenda sort of fully fleshed out. So I guess reasonably good news that I mean, it's understandable, I guess, that there are some of you who are finding it pretty challenging, because I think certainly in some areas it's not necessarily what charities have been looking to do. So yes, that's again some interesting findings. So looking again at the third principle now, and this is around having some clear, specific actions that new ministers will be able to take sort of early on. So I'm really thinking about, alongside, you know, you want to be able to present your clear vision of where you want to take the policy area, of course. But it's also useful to have those sort of few specific actions that new ministers can take. So I'm thinking really things which are quite low cost, potentially cost neutral, things that are unlikely to require number 10 approval, but can also demonstrate that a minister is kind of taking action early and really kind of getting into their role and doing things. So from a kind of NCVO point of view, I can think of some of the asks we might have in transparency and public service delivery. So our quite specific recommendations around having charity or company numbers in contract finder award notices, transparency clauses in Crown commercial services contracts. So very specific, quite technical things potentially, but actually those things which are relatively straightforward to do can be, I think, quite useful. Out of interest, if anyone is, apparently Margaret Thatcher's ministerial red box. I think the modern ones are in better condition, but one thing I've learned in the last few days is it's surprisingly difficult to find a generic photo of a ministerial red box. So I've already talked about focusing on where your expertise can be of use to government, but the other thing to remember is that people in government are not necessarily so much interested in your organisation, but actually they're more interested in who you represent. So as charities, ultimately we're representing our beneficiaries, and so we need to be able to demonstrate to a new government that when we talk to them, we're providing a voice for those beneficiaries, and also that we're able to facilitate that direct contact with them. So from an NCVO point of view, we represent charities, so we need to demonstrate to government that we're able to both speak on behalf of charities, but also we want the government to think of us when they want to talk to charities. So whatever bit of the charity sector you represent, do you think about how you can sort of enable those links? So, for example, if perhaps if you're a charity with local branches, you might want to set up a visit with a new minister to come to see those what the charity is doing locally. If you're a charity that delivers services, you might want to set something up where ministers, potentially officials, get to speak directly to service users. And also, sometimes if you've got your kind of policy roundtables, think about actually, can you involve those beneficiaries? Can you involve service users perhaps in those discussions as well? So a few kind of different ways that you can make those links. So it's worth remembering as well that as you engage with new government, it's not just about ministers. Special advisors are another important routes for you to consider. Those relationships, I think, can be quite challenging to build. I think the thing about special advisors, they're often as busy as ministers, but they probably don't quite have that the job description that requires as much. They can be a bit more selective about who they speak to, I think. So they will only talk to you if they think you're going to be important. We are now starting to see a bit of a list coming together of who some of the special advisors are. So I think it's definitely worth approaching appropriate special advisors to introduce yourself and to make clear what it is that you're able to help them with as they carry on their job. You may also find that you might have some new senior officials as well. So as I mentioned before, with the Office for Civil Society moving to DCMS, we are now working with a different permanent secretary, so Sue Owen at DCMS. And that, I think, feels like an opportunity for us to have a bit more influence on those wider departmental responsibilities. So in the same way as you approach working with a new minister, I think it's really important to think about who those key officials are, who are going to be making a lot of the decisions that will impact on you. But also during these times of change, remember that continuity is often provided by sort of more junior officials, so your everyday civil service contacts. Yes, building relationships with new ministers is important, but remember they're going to be advised by those officials on who it is who's important to engage with. So they're almost, in many ways, acting as the gatekeepers, especially for new ministers who might know a bit less about the area. And as well are probably your best opportunity of finding out what's going on and where departmental priorities are changing. So aside from the opportunities that new governments are going to present for engagement, I think it's worth thinking well about what it means in Parliament. So one of the things about Theresa May's reshuffle, it was actually pretty brutal in some cases, especially if you were someone who'd tied your career to George Osborne. Lots of the kind of former Osborne-sponsored ministers are now gone and sitting on the backbenches, and they're going to be looking for things to do. So definitely an opportunity for you to work with them. We're also going to be seeing some select committee changes. So for us, we are the main committee that we work with will change from the Public Administration Committee to the Culture, Media and Sport Committee. And we're also going to get a new chair of that committee, as Jessie Norman has been appointed as a minister. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how and if charity policy goes across. And I think the other kind of really big bit of select committee scrutiny that's going to be taking place in the next few years is around Brexit. So as there is now a department for exiting the EU, a new select committee will be created when MPs return in September. I have though seen a bit of, I think there was a sense there could be a special format designed to scrutinise the Brexit side of things a bit better. So I've certainly seen talk of something similar to the Commission on Banking Standards that we had a few years ago, which was sort of a much bigger committee, including people from both houses, and enabled them to be sort of a bit more wide-ranging. I've even, I think, heard talk of sort of 30 committee members, perhaps potentially in a Brexit committee, which sounds quite a lot to me. But I should say as well, I have blogged on this in more detail on the NCVO site if you do want to take a look at what we think some of the select committee changes mean for charities. So there's been a lot of talk about potential split in the Labour Party. I think it's very unlikely that we're going to see any imminent split. But that said, while Corbyn remains leader, I think it's quite likely that we'll see in Parliament at least Labour effectively functioning as two parties. So you'll have the official front bench position, but also a kind of backbench alternative view. And I think that potentially there are opportunities for charities, because I think you can go into both of those sides and engage with them. But yeah, clearly that's going to be a bit challenging. And then I think more generally, actually, it's quite important to be engaging with different wings of different parties to improve the chance of your message getting through. So perhaps think about which parts of the Conservative Party are less in the ascendancy that were, and maybe you can work with them as well. And also, I think what the situation with the Labour Party at the moment means that because there is Commons getting changes to Commons business can be pretty difficult because you don't necessarily have that united opposition, which is going to really help you to get your amendments through. So I think even more so than normal, the Lords is really the place to go if you want to amend legislation. Labour Party in particular are kind of essentially now functioning separately in the Lords from their Commons leaders. So some definite opportunities there. So we've got a final poll question before we move on to the Q&A. So I was just interested in getting a sense of what the #1 priorities of people's engagement strategy is at the moment. So we've got a few options there. We can only have 5 options, so we'll potentially have had a few more. So we've got new ministers there, departmental officials, the opposition front bench, backbenchers or other. So just interesting, I think, to get a sense of what it is that people are prioritising at the moment, and who people think are really the kind of key people to be targeting. So we just again have to wait for the results to come through. Okay, so I think that's not that surprising that I would have expected new ministers to be very high on this, because I think, yeah, in many ways they are the priority. But very interesting that I think that we've got departmental officials there as a kind of a key, the key role as well. I think notable how opposition front bench is perhaps not the best place to be going at the moment. But yes, some interesting findings there. Okay, so I've hopefully been providing questions as we go. So I will try and answer as many of these as I can, and some we've got left. So Richard has asked, so it would be good to hear about different methods and tactics in with new SPADs. Given how notoriously cagey they are, I'd be interested to hear Chris's experience in getting through the door. So I don't think unfortunately, there's not kind of like a magic answer to this, an obvious way to get in. I mentioned a little bit during the presentation about how I think having quite a positive approach can help. Not being kind of the person who gets in touch with the SPAD when things are going wrong, but someone who is kind of there and able to engage over a long period of time. And so I think really just being quite responsive, knowing how you can help them to do their job is quite important. But yeah, I think it is. It's a really interesting challenge, and of course the other thing is perhaps even more than ministers actually. I think SPADs will have really different approaches. Some really want to engage quite widely with stakeholders. Others I kind of feel like they've kind of got a sense of what they want to do and will have very specific people they want to talk to. So I hope there's been a few things to think about in the webinar, but yeah, SPADs are definitely a challenge I think to in terms of targeting. Faye has asked, what do you think are the best ways to get in touch with the new minister? I guess this is quite practical. I mean, I still think the kind of formal letter is probably the backbone of what you're going to do in terms of that engagement. Getting something actually that goes directly to their private office at least, and makes it clear that you want to engage is good. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that while all that sort of stuff, the formal side is going on, making sure that you're in regular contact with officials and offering opportunities to ministers to do that. So I mentioned during the presentation things like visits. I think I missed out talking about speaking opportunities as well. So you may want to give a speaking opportunity to a new minister. I think you need to be a little bit sparing sometimes with that, because you probably get sort of one or two good shots at that, I guess, a year generally. Sometimes if you're very lucky, you've got a very good relationship with the minister, you might get more. But really thinking about what's going to be most useful for the minister, and also what's going to be most useful for you as a charity. Becky has asked, mentioning the reformist wing of the Conservative Party, what does this mean in practice, and what kind of reform? So I think there's probably kind of like a few different bits of this. So there is a sort of bit of the kind of what you might call a sort of one nation people who are what you might think of as the traditional left of the Conservative Party, or perhaps a bit more open to sort of the kind of like sort of old style Conservative policy agenda, a bit more relaxed about higher taxes, that sort of side of things. I think there was also a part of the Conservative Party which sometimes can be on the right as well, which is quite socially concerned. So looking at different ways that you can get to kind of poor groups. So I think particularly it's almost kind of like Christian socialist tradition. I think Tim Montgomery is, although I can't remember if he's in the Conservative Party or not at the moment, but that kind of tradition as well. Jessica has asked, does each department have a group of shared SPADs, or are they assigned to particular ministers? So essentially, cabinet office, so cabinet ministers get a sort of certain allocation. So traditionally that's been 3 or 2 in some for some departments. It depends kind of how senior you are. So they are attached to the Secretary of State, but I think they often then also work with other ministers in the department. So although they are effectively the cabinet ministers special advisors, they will kind of work outside there. And then the other SPADs to remember about are the number 10 SPADs, so they will have a more wide-ranging view. So maybe you have departmental special advisors who you want to build a relationship with, or alternatively there are these advisors in number 10. I think it's not quite clear actually with number 10 yet who's going to be covering what, and still a few roles to fill there. So it'd be interesting to see how they fill that. Patrick has asked, are some organisations right to perceive the Minister for Civil Society move to DCMS as a demotion? Does this signal a shift in how charities are perceived by the government? I think it'd be hard. I think it'd be hard to describe as a demotion, really. So Cabinet Office, in theory, it does have the ear of the. Well, it has the Prime Minister as the lead minister in the department, but in practice, it doesn't really work like that. And I don't really get the sense that Cabinet Office has been massively influential in the last few years. So I think demotion doesn't really feel like the right word for me. But it's obviously there are kind of new challenges. So as I mentioned in the presentation, I think there's some positive potentially things potentially. I think particularly that opportunity to have a cabinet minister actually around the cabinet table who has charities in their brief in a way that didn't really happen with Cabinet Office. But I think easier perhaps to engage with the wider department outside Office for Civil Society than it perhaps was with Cabinet Office. But I guess we'll have to wait and see on some of the. I certainly think there are some policy areas that aren't really a natural fit with DCMS, to be honest. So I think if you're looking purely from what does this mean for policy, instinctively you would think it means a lessening of kind of the thinking around public services, social investment. But the noises we've heard so far suggest those kind of key priorities. So I think how we could tease that out from government and get them to commit to this would be important. Rachel has asked, do you think media campaigns have any role to play when working with the new government? I think potentially. I suppose if you were, if you're thinking of kind of the insider-outsider approaches, and your outsider is very much this kind of public pressure, media-driven side of things, then I sort of feel like new minister is probably when you're at your most insider, if that works as a phrase. So you've just got this real opportunity to kind of work quite closely with a new minister, to talk directly to them. I think generally given the benefit of the doubt, unless there is good reason not to give them the benefit of the doubt. So I think any media around that sort of engagement with the new minister, I would try and make quite positive. It won't always be the case. It does depend a little bit on what your situation is and what the government's doing. But I think generally this is quite a good time to really kind of emphasise the positive and really, if you are going to use press as part of your strategy for engagement with the new minister, kind of actually it's almost a bit of flattery saying, yeah, this is someone who we think is going to really drive through this agenda and really be supportive of what we want to do. Helen has asked, how useful do you think it would be to approach and forge links with the shadow cabinet over the following few months? I think this is a really interesting question that I think not just the charity sector is wrestling with, but I think all kind of public affairs lobbyists are really thinking about this. I think it's important. We don't quite know what form the Labour Party will take, how things will line up in the future. So I would continue to be seeking to engage with the front bench. I think it's really challenging. I think expect that it's not necessarily going to be one of those where it's easy to get through the door, just because people don't have the capacity and the time in the way that opposition front bench normally would. There normally much more people covering all of the different areas. But yeah, I think that's it's clearly important. They're going to be important in parliamentary terms. They are going to be responding to legislation, and potentially there is an opportunity there because given that there'll be, won't be masses of time to work on some of the things that, some of the more technical things that we do at charities. Actually, I think the opposition front bench can be really reliant on the external briefings they get. So I think there is an opportunity for charities, but yeah, I certainly think it feels like it's not at the moment the place where you're going to get your kind of biggest results. But I think it's important to, as ever with the opposition, make sure you're talking to a wide range of people who can assist where they can. Liz has asked if we have any idea how a new government is likely to view recent committee reports, and have any sign of a general new green attitude. I think it's pretty difficult to say at the moment, actually. And it probably depends a bit on how it sort of fits with their agenda. I mean, I think perhaps if we look at the kind of Theresa May approach generally, we think she's going to be quite considered over things. Going to take lots of different things into account. So that sort of suggests that I think she's going to take a quite considered approach to things. So hopefully that will mean that she will take some committee reports seriously. I think we've got time for one more question. So Ellie has asked, how useful do you think petitions can be? I think increasingly, actually, from my perspective, I think we've seen a couple of really good petitions inspired by charities. I think one of the key things that has emerged that the Petitions Committee have done, which is really good, is that it's not just about numbers. I think it's really about when there are kind of important issues, then it's not just about weights of numbers, and you can really convince the committee that it's an important area to cover. Okay, so I'm afraid that is all the time we have for your questions, and I'll just hand you back to Woody.
Thank you, Chris. I hope you enjoyed that, and hopefully you've had your interest piqued by Chris. And if so, we have a couple of events coming up here at NCVO to help you further your campaigning, or if you want to know a bit more about implementing government. So in 2 weeks' time, we have the campaigning conference on the 6th of September, and Chris will actually be running another workshop there, this time on helping to engage the public parliament. We'll also be running a workshop there on looking at Brexit and beyond Brexit and what that will mean for your organisation. We will also be running the next tranche of the leadership in campaigns on the 6th of October and developing a winning campaign strategy plan on the 14th of October. The certificate in campaigning starts on the 18th of October. Influencing Parliament, again run by Chris, is on the 25th of November, and Influencing Select Committees is on the 9th of December. We also have some follow-up reading, which is the NCVO Good Guide to Campaigning and Influencing. And I think there's some further links that we'll be following up with in the email after this.